Good evening from Washington, D.C., and good morning in Jakarta and Canberra. My name is Greg Brown. I'm a Senior Fellow and Director of Regional Cooperation and Coordination at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, USA. I want to welcome our panelists this evening and to everyone attending online to this timely webinar, Evolving Security Relationships between the U.S., Indonesia, and Australia. ASPI USA is an independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit organization in Washington, D.C., dedicated to addressing policy challenges facing the United States, Australia, and their partners in a rapidly changing world. We're an overseas affiliate of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra. That's Australia's leading national security and defense think tank. At ASPI USA, we pressure test policy, shine the light into gaps in national security and defense, educate the public on Australian and regional perspectives within an evolving political landscape, and explore future problems through original research, analysis, and collaboration with other experts. Again, thank you for joining us this evening, and I'll turn the time over to my colleague, Patrick Centeno. Patrick.
Hi. Thank you, Greg. My name is Patrick Centeno, an analyst intern here at ASPI USA. And good evening from Washington, and selamat pagi semuanya over in Indonesia. So we thank you for joining us in our webinar, The Evolving Security Relationship between the US, Indonesia, and Australia. Indonesia, the US, and Australia have all undergone elections within the past year, putting forth the rise of Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto, the return of US President Donald Trump, and the continuation of Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. While there is new leadership amongst these states, the bilateral relationships that tie these nations together are not a new tale. Australia and Indonesia are neighbors with a long-standing history. The two nations help one another with humanitarian assistance and are involved in trade and educational exchanges. The US-Indonesia partnership dates to US assistance for Indonesian independence and later humanitarian assistance during the tragic 2004 Boxing Day tsunamis that struck the region. And not to mention the salient US-Australian alliance that extends to the greater cooperation in AUKUS and the Quad. Each state carries its own security and economic issues, as well as national triumphs. However, no nation operates alone. Today, we are joined by three astounding panelists to discuss the security and economic issues that burden these nations and identify current and potential areas for cooperation and coordination. Our first panelist, Dr. Gatra Priyandita, will discuss Indonesian foreign policy and policy under President Prabowo and what it means for the US and Australia. Followed by Dr. Anne-Marie Murphy, who will focus on US foreign policy under President Trump and national security prerogatives. Then Ms. Mahu Sitabu to highlight what the critical markets are for Indonesia as it grows its economy and how this ties in with Australian and American foreign policy. Now, to introduce our first panelist. Dr. Gatra Priyandita is a senior analyst with ASPI's Cyber Technology and Security Program. His research focuses on cyber politics in emerging economies, as well as foreign policy, defense, and security issues in Southeast Asia. A political scientist by training, Dr. Priyandita has more than a decade of research experience, working extensively on projects regarding Indonesian foreign policy, Southeast Asian security, and comparative cyber politics and policy. His analysis has appeared in multiple news outlets and academic journals and think tank publications. Dr. Priyandita also currently serves as a visiting fellow at the Australian National University's Department of Political and Social Change. He was formerly a non-resident WSD Fahanda Fellow at the Pacific Forum, where he remains a part of its Young Leaders program. Dr. Priyandita also has past affiliations with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, University of Indonesia, and Jinan University. Gatra holds a PhD in political science from Australian National University. It's great and wonderful to meet with you today, Gatra. Thank you for joining us from Canberra. So I just wanted to mention that across the 10 years of the presidency of Pak Jokowi, prior to President Prabowo, Indonesia increased its presence on the international stage, led as ASEAN chair in 2023, and underwent security challenges in South China Sea, Papua, and across digital infrastructure. Given the new leadership of President Prabowo, there are new and bold foreign policy initiatives that we are already seeing take place. Can you speak on this?
Well, thanks so much, Pat, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone from Canberra. Let me just at the outset thank ASPI USA for inviting me to speak at this webinar on the subject of Indonesian foreign policy under President Prabowo. Now, to directly answer your question, yes, I think we've definitely seen some bold foreign policy moves by the new president. I think the most important of these initiatives have been the decision by Indonesia to join BRICS. This was a decision that can largely be attributed to Prabowo himself. And the defining feature of the Prabowo presidency compared to the previous one is the foreign policy activism of the president himself. Despite all of this, I do think that for the most part, the Prabowo presidency has demonstrated more semblances of continuity with the foreign policy orthodoxy rather than change. A lot of this continuity, I think, largely stems from established domestic demands, entrenched foreign policy cultures, and so on. But where we do see a bit of change, I think, really comes from the personal idiosyncrasies of President Prabowo himself, and I think his dependence on informal networks for advice. Now, all of this ultimately really shapes how Indonesia engages with the world, including how it manages its relationship with Australia and the United States. Now, when talking about Indonesian foreign policy, I think fundamentally it's important to talk about, first and foremost, the president and their worldviews, because the president remains probably the key foreign policymaker in the country. And this is very much so under President Prabowo, because as I mentioned, he has a personal interest in foreign policy. President Jokowi, his predecessor, was more interested in domestic issues. So on foreign policy matters, he oftentimes deferred to the foreign minister or other key actors in the state. But for Prabowo, he doesn't have that many foreign policy advisors. I think very much so, his primary foreign policy advisor is himself. And, so it's very important to understand his worldview. And his worldview is very much, I think, informed by the importance of material power and strength for national security. So if you listen to his speeches, for example, they're often very much peppered with references to Indonesia's colonial past, and the struggle of weaker societies under the subjugation of much stronger powers. As a presidential candidate throughout much of the 2010s, he has long criticized what he saw were the exploitation of foreign powers in Indonesia. So, for example, he often talked about the plight of European imperialism in the past. And when he did criticize China, it was mostly in the context of China, for example, extracting fishes into the sea or exploiting Indonesian labor, Chinese labor, using Chinese labor for their infrastructure project. So this nationalist undertone really feeds into his worldview that for Indonesia to remain independent and secure, it must increase its material power. Of course, he was previously defense minister before he became president, and he believes that in the importance of military strength and that national security is integral to economic prosperity. As defense minister, he really pushed hard to modernize Indonesia's military. As president, he aims to continue that focus and is working towards, I think, boosting the defense budget from around 0.7% to 1.5% of GDP by 2029. And he's really after building, indigenous defense capabilities, but also really working together with countries like the US, like France, like Australia as well, on defense industry. Now, security and defense are important for Prabowo, but so is economics. And while Prabowo emphasizes the need for a stronger defense for the country, he has repeatedly expressed his fervent desire for Indonesia to remain non-aligned, especially in the face of great power rivalry. Now, the key driver of a lot of his engagements, I think, largely is still largely made by the economic imperative, right? His campaign manifesto commits to continuing the Jokowi administration's vision of transforming Indonesia into an advanced economy by 2045. He himself has said that he wants to see Indonesia bolster its economic growth to around 8% by the end of his term at the very least. So economics will continue to drive, I think, Indonesia's foreign policy and development. And that, I think, makes a lot of sense given the country itself, right? I mean, Indonesia is still a developing country with around 280 million people, with serious infrastructure deficits. It's very much interested in sort of moving up the global value chain. For example, he has inherited that vision of transforming Indonesia, becoming a major node in the supply chain for the production of electric vehicles. So the development imperative, I think, and this need to pursue economic gain, I think has partly fostered the need for Indonesia to maintain friendly ties with all nations. An attitude that really sort of emerged during the Asian financial crisis and the growing need for foreign capital. Prabowo has sort of revived the mantra of former President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, which was that Indonesia had to adopt a position where it would create 1 million friends and 0 enemies. So this approach was very much about strategic interest, I think, as it was about economic interest and a desire to be able to tap into as much foreign capital as possible. Now, given these economic imperatives, so I think continuity in the substance of Indonesian foreign policy should be expected, and we have seen a lot of continuity in that sense. After all, I think this preference for development, a development-focused foreign policy, is really a product of elite consensus that aims to satisfy the interests of sort of as many groups that ultimately shape Indonesia's domestic and foreign relations. Despite his tough man aura, Prabowo still needs to satisfy the multiple interest groups in the country, be it the oligarchs who are key to sort of supporting him during elections, or of course the military and their continued desire for modern equipment, as well as, of course, Indonesia's senior diplomats who are strong advocates of Indonesia's non-aligned credentials. All of these competing interests mean that Prabowo, or any other person for that matter, will need to ensure that there is room for pragmatism and compromise in foreign policy. For this reason, despite the strongman aura, Prabowo is going to be pragmatic, for example, when he approaches US-China competition. He is known to have some affinity for the West, favoring closer defense ties with the US and Australia, and despite having opportunistically criticized the Jokowi government's courting of Chinese capital in the past, he sees China still as a country worthy of emulation. So while Prabowo is historically critical of China's ventures in the South China Sea, he is equally cautious that any action should not disrupt the flow of Chinese capital. And in fact, I think he wants to see continued Chinese capital into Indonesia. And this somewhat explains, I think, the joint statement that Indonesia signed with China back in late 2024. Now, that an Indonesian president must balance competing economic and security interests is not new. Where I do think that a Prabowo foreign policy is unique, may come less from his understanding of the world and more from his personal idiosyncrasies, as well as, again, the informal networks that make up his environment. Prabowo, he is known to be quite impatient, prone to anger, deeply emotional. So all of this means that he has been quite unpredictable sometimes, often disregarding the counsel of his advisors. So of course, this impacts domestic policy as much as foreign policy. The foreign policy elite in Indonesia today are primarily, consist primarily of his loyalists. And these are loyalists who also share his worldviews. You have Defense Minister Shafri Samsudin, who is an old mate of Prabowo going back to their earlier years in the military. And Foreign Minister Sugiono is a loyal stalwart from the Gerindra party. Now, this detail matters, obviously, because I think when you're a foreign or defense minister, part of your job is also sometimes to defend, firstly, the corporate interests of your ministry, but then also the corporate interests as well as the orthodoxy, but sometimes also to be able to push back the president when it needs to happen, right? Given that they're all of the same mold, I think it's very difficult to see Prabowo facing much internal backlash, for example, for any foreign policy proposal he makes. So what does this all mean for Indonesia's relationship with the US and Australia? I think, broadly, I think Prabowo has a very positive view of both Australia and the United States. As I said, he has had some affinity for both countries. He did some military training in the US. And Australia has always really stood out in his speeches, I think, when he speaks about Western countries. Whenever he speaks about Europeans, for example, there's often a tint of criticism about the past, the colonial past. But whenever he talks about Australia, he often talks about Australia's contributions in Indonesia's independence. So all of these views are obviously very positive, right? Now, where perspectives in Australia is unique is also that I think where Prabowo differs from, say, Jokowi is that, or any other minister when Prabowo was minister under Jokowi, was that Prabowo had a more, I think, empathetic understanding of the power-based arrangements that are in the Indo-Pacific, so things like the AUKUS and things like AUKUS and Quad. So he has said that he understands why Australia and the United States must cooperate together through the AUKUS and Quad arrangements. Now, I mean, I argue that I do think that this understanding does not necessarily mean support. It just means understanding. But at the very least, given again that Prabowo sees the world through the lens of, I think, a fairly realist lens of material power equals strength and security, I think he understands deeply why AUKUS and Quad can be somewhat necessary. And for the most part, while Indonesian officials are strong advocates of, say, things like ASEAN centrality, the importance of the ASEAN mechanism as a center of regional architecture, there's also deep awareness that for ASEAN Plus mechanisms and institutions to work, you need a bit of power of military power to bolster that. I think back in the early 90s, for example, Foreign Minister Ali Alatas made a comment that he was defending the U.S.-Japan alliance as being one of the bedrocks of regional security in the Asia-Pacific. Now, it's hard to see any other foreign minister in contemporary Indonesia, post-war Indonesia, say that. But having said that, I think, again, there's that understanding and awareness. I think broadly, and this is not specific to Prabowo, but the broader foreign policy blob in Indonesia, the question that continues to linger concerning these power-based arrangements is whether the Quad or AUKUS arrangements really do have that deterring effect against malign state actors, and whether they can actually contribute to the public good. Now, of course, this is an issue that's also actively debated, not just in Indonesia, but of course in Australia as well, in the public discourse at least, but in the US and other places, right? I think for the most part, a long-standing challenge for the Australia-Indonesia relationship that I think affects the US relationship with the US as well is this idea about how is this argument that both Australia and Indonesia have different perspectives on how to manage strategic competition or respond to strategic competition between the US and China. I think both Australian and Indonesian officials, for the most part, agree that the rise of China has negative implications, can have negative implications, has security implications, and that it has to be a check to it. But where there's I think disagreement is over what the role of the United States should be. And while I think Australia, especially in the past few years, pre-Albanese, but also still under Albanese, has been sort of doubling down on that security relationship with the U.S. despite its attempts to stabilize ties with China. The perspective in Indonesia is that the United States is at best seen as a necessary balancer to the rise of China as well as the potential rise of other countries in the Asia-Pacific, but at worst a predatory great power, right? So because of this, I think you see this disagreement right now publicly about AUKUS and Quad, about uncertainties about what these arrangements mean. So the strategic divergence, I think, becomes a problem, particularly in the Indonesia-Australia relationship, because I think while Australia and Indonesia are comprehensive strategic partners, the relationship is far more comprehensive than it is strategic. There isn't really any arrangement that has been designed, I think, in the past few years that sort of is at the level of, say, the level of counterterrorism cooperation, in the 2000s or on people smuggling. Just to quickly conclude, because I think I've spoken over time, overall, I think under Prabowo, Indonesia's foreign policy shows more continuity than change in terms of substance. Continuity, again, comes from the fact that you need to address a lot of the economic issues in the country. There are entrenched foreign policy interests, and all of this lead to preferences that for non-alignment, for multilateralism, and for friendly ties with all states. Where there might be change again is with Prabowo's own personal idiosyncrasies, his own interest in foreign policy, as well as the informal networks. All of this means, thus far, it will probably see a continued positive trajectory in ties with the US and Australia. But of course, there can be things that pop up. Yeah, I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gatra. Now to transition to U.S. foreign policy, we have Dr. Anne-Marie Murphy here with us from Seton Hall University. Dr. Anne-Marie Murphy is professor at the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University and senior research fellow at Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University. Her research focuses on Southeast Asian international politics and political change. Dr. Murphy's most recent books include an edited volume of Southeast Asia Views the United States, Perceptions, Policies, and Prospects, and Non-Traditional Security Issues in Southeast Asia, the Transnational Dimension, co-authored with Amy Friedman. Dr. Murphy's articles have appeared in journals such as Asian Security, Contemporary Southeast Asia, Orbis, Asia Policy, World Politics Review, and PS, Political Science and Politics. Dr. Murphy's research has been supported by grants from the Smith Richardson Foundation, the National Asia Research Program, the Social Science Research Council, the Fulbright Scholars Program, and she was recently a Mansfield Luce Asia Scholar. She serves as the editorial board of Asia Policy, the board of directors for the Center of Khmer Studies, and is co-founder of the New York Southeast Asian Network, a Luce Foundation-funded initiative to promote Southeast Asian studies in the United States, and she earned her PhD from Columbia University. Thank you for being here with us, Dr. Murphy.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to you, Greg, and everybody at ASPI USA for this invitation to participate. Before turning directly to U.S.-Indonesia relations, I want to make a few remarks about the broader U.S. Indo-Pacific policy within which strategy towards Indonesia will be framed. In much of the analysis that I see, particularly in the Indonesian press, there's an assumption that strategic competition with China will be the defining feature of U.S. Indo-Pacific policy in Trump's second term, just as it was in his first. And therefore, that Indonesia will rise in strategic importance to Washington as the U.S. seeks to forge a coalition of allies and partners to counter China. Yet, in my view, it's unclear whether this will be the case. To date, U.S. foreign policy has focused on areas other than Asia, the Middle East, with the Gaza conflict, Yemen, Iran, in Europe, obviously, with the Ukraine war, more recently with the Indo-Pacific crisis. And Washington has not yet articulated an Indo-Pacific strategy. And there are debates about what it should be within the Republican Party. And there's a number of kind of views and categories among certain actors. First, there are the what we might call primicists, the Ronald Reagan Republicans, who advocate an increased defense budget and strong alliances in Europe and Asia to compete with the new China, Russia, Iran, North Korea axis. The second are what might be called the Asia prioritizers or pivoters, hyper-pivoters, who call for the U.S. to leave Europe to Europe and focus all attention on Asia and China, a position strongly advocated by Undersecretary of Defense Eldridge Colby. Third are the restrainers, or the America Firsters, who contend that the U.S. should pull back on foreign commitments to focus on domestic affairs in the Americas, therefore creating the potential for Europe and Asia to become spheres of influence for Russia and China. And it seems to me that most of the debate within the administration is really between the Asia prioriters and the restrainers. In the first Trump administration, U.S. Indo-Pacific policy was orchestrated by people like Secretary of State Pompeo, a traditional Ronald Reagan Republican, a China hawk. And when we look today, we do see that some officials like Secretary of State Marco Rubio had traditionally supported such views. And yet, since taking office, they have subordinated these views in favor of Trump's postures. And although I should note that there's many Republicans in Congress who had, under the previous administration, voted for aid to Ukraine, et cetera, to date, they have ceded these powers to the executive branch, and whether they eventually take a stand remains to be seen. Therefore, when we analyze U.S. policy towards Asia, we see much more actions that accord with both the restraint and the Asia priority view, creating this contradiction. So on the one hand, you see Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth in Europe, calling for a reduction in U.S. commitment to Europe, slashing the defense budget by over $5 trillion, and pledging to cut 20% of the military's 4-star generals, all consistent with a position of restraint. At the same time, in visits to the Philippines and Japan, Hegseth touted the ironclad commitment of the U.S. to its Asian allies and stressed the U.S. interest in the South China Sea, obviously positions consistent with an Asian priority. So how these two different trends play out really remains to be seen. And now, beyond these kind of different factions in the Republican Party, it's important to note that just as Gatra said that in Indonesia, Prabowo is the key decision maker, so too in the United States, U.S. foreign policy is increasingly the purview of one man, Donald Trump. And Trump has no hard convictions or foreign policy ideology outside of belief that outsiders are ripping the U.S. off and that tariffs are a useful tool to redress trade deficits. Therefore, while some might see Trump's imposition of 145% tariffs on China as evidence of his commitment to an anti-China Indo-Pacific policy, I don't think that this can be taken for granted. Trump tends to view allies and adversaries through the lens of his personal ties with foreign leaders. And we certainly see this with his bromance with Vladimir Putin, right? Which initially led the U.S. to abandon Ukraine, agree to many Russian demands, but when Putin didn't adhere to a ceasefire that Trump had wanted him to, we now see Trump threatening Russia with new sanctions, illustrating the real capriciousness of a one-man foreign policy. With China's Xi, Trump has said that he has great respect for President Xi, that President Xi has been a friend for a long time, and he thinks the two can work productively together, something supported by the recent tariff deal. So how this plays out with regard to China remains to be seen. And why is this so important for U.S. security policy towards Indonesia? Because if the U.S. centers its Indo-Pacific policy on countering China, as it did in his first term, then Indonesia will likely be the target of U.S. pressure to choose sides and align with the U.S. once again. This pressure will be unwanted in Indonesia, where President Prabowo, as Gatra has indicated, advocates a staunchly non-aligned policy and has backed it up by joining the BRICS, visiting Russia, and a slew of other policy initiatives. Moreover, if Trump does go with a strong anti-China policy, it will complicate Indonesia-U.S. security cooperation, since it will create the impression that this cooperation is directed against China, a perception that Indonesia will seek to avoid. On the other hand, if the U.S.-China ties improve and Trump adopts a policy of restraint, then this creates greater strategic space for Indonesia to promote its own strategic autonomy through its preferred non-aligned policy, as Gatra indicated, and it creates greater scope for U.S.-Indonesian security cooperation. So let me get to that. Obviously, U.S.-Indonesia military ties have vacillated dramatically over the years, from what former Defense Minister Yono Sudarsono once called a quasi-alliance during the Cold War to a U.S. arms embargo and complete cutoff following the East Timor referendum in 1991, obviously something that impacted President Prabowo, who was denied a visa for 2 decades as a result. When we look at interests, we see that both the U.S. and Indonesia have a keen interest in the stability of the Indo-Pacific maritime domain, where Indonesia's strategic position straddling those sea lanes of communication make it a critical actor. But the two sides' interests are different. The U.S. has an interest in freedom of navigation through those sea lanes, while Indonesia has a vital interest in protecting its maritime sovereignty and rights. Therefore, the two sides have differences of opinion over the usefulness of certain strategic tools to promote maritime stability. The U.S. uses freedom of navigation exercise to protest what it views as claims that exceed the rights granted under the UN Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, and claims that FONOPs are therefore a mechanism to uphold global rules and stability. In contrast, Indonesia views them, as Luhut Panjaitan once stated, as an unwanted power projection because they risk the escalation of China and therefore negatively impact, in its view, projects for stability. So if we look at two metrics of Indonesian U.S. security cooperation, military exercises, and acquisitions of military equipment, we see that they both increased when Prabowo was Minister of Defense. The long-standing bilateral Garuda Shield, as Gatra noted, is now a multinational exercise, I should say, that puts Indonesia on the map as the convener of a major multi-domain exercise that last year involved 19 participating and observer states. If we look at military acquisitions, we see that Indonesia signed a deal in 2023 for 24 F-15 jets, as well as Black Hawk helicopters. And this comes after in 2021, Indonesia formally requesting permission to purchase 48 F-35s, which the U.S. State Department granted permission for. These deals are valued at 8 and 14 billion, respectively. They've both been held up for funding purposes or funding shortfalls on the Indonesian side. And more recently, there have been many concerns in Indonesia about debates over whether the U.S. has a quote-unquote kill switch, which can allow it to halt technology and intel necessary for these planes to operate as planned. The U.S. has denied this, but the fraught history of mill-to-mill cooperation, or relations, I should say, means that there is a trust deficit, and many Indonesians remain suspicious of U.S. motives. Since the Trump imposed 32% tariffs on Indonesia, there's been discussion of moving forward with some of these arms purchases in order to reduce the trade deficit, but whether that happens remains to be seen. Beyond the military exercises and defense acquisition, we do see strong counterterrorism cooperation, intelligence, and cooperation on maritime domain awareness technology. I'm running out of time, but I just want to say a few words on non-traditional security cooperation, because this is where I think we're likely to see a more dramatic change than in the traditional domain. Outside of counterterrorism, I think we're really going to see a dramatic reduction. The dismantling of USAID, which was the lead institution for the U.S. on many transnational issues, and budget cuts have left the U.S. unable to respond to national disasters, as we saw recently with the Myanmar earthquake. The support previous U.S. administrations provided to Indonesia for climate change mitigation and adaptation will not be forthcoming in a government of climate change deniers. On global health, the U.S. withdrew from the WHO, and under Secretary of Health Robert Kennedy, a vaccine denier, is not developing vaccines for either COVID or the flu. So we're unlikely to have those vaccines this upcoming year, which means the U.S. is unlikely to be able to help out in the event of a pandemic. and on clean energy, the U.S., which had been the co-leader with Japan on the Just Energy Transition Partnership, has withdrawn from that. So on these range of non-traditional security issues, there is going to be a distinct lack of cooperation, and how the broader U.S. Indo-Pacific policy plays out will affect U.S.-Indonesia security ties. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to questions in the Q&A.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, for sharing your expertise on U.S.-Indonesia security ties. So finally, we have Ms. Mahu Sitabu joining us from Washington, D.C. Ms. Mahu Sitabu is an Associate Vice President of the Asia Group Southeast Asia practice, where she supports clients navigating the region's complex political and regulatory environments to build business strategies across a variety of sectors, including banking and finance, hospitality, manufacturing, and technology. With a decade's experience as a journalist in Indonesia, including 3 years in a senior role at BBC News, Ms. Sitepu has a strong knowledge of Southeast Asia and a far-reaching network of contacts. She has interviewed high-level figures, including Indonesian president and foreign firms and leaders and business leaders. Ms. Sitepu also maintained close relations with foreign firms during her 3 years as a member of the executive committee of the Jakarta Foreign Correspondents Club. Prior to joining the Asia Group, she earned a Master of International Affairs degree from Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. So it's great to have you with us today, Ms. Sitepu. It's great to see you.
Hi, Patrick. Great to see you. Yeah, and thank you, Greg and ASPI friends, for inviting me. And yes, Anne-Marie, Columbia, roar, lion, roar.
There you go.
All right. So yeah, if you talk about the most important sectors for Indonesia to partner with the US and Australia, I think we have to begin with the priorities set by President Prabowo. So his main goal is to create jobs, eradicate or reduce poverty, and one of which is through the free meal program. So these priorities will will point us towards the 3 sectors that I think will be a good way for collaboration between the 3 countries, which is agriculture, higher education, and healthcare. So first, agriculture. As you all know, President Prabowo has launched one of the boldest food policy initiatives in recent memory, a free meal program for school students. This program is not only a welfare initiative, but it's also a national development strategy initially laid out by his dad, his father, who is a prominent economist. So the government aims to feed around 20 million children this year, which will require an estimated 7 million tons of rice, 1.2 million tons of chicken, 500 tons of beef, 1 million tons of fish, fruits and vegetables, and 4 million kiloliters of milk. So for American friends, I don't know how many gallons that is, but it's a lot. And so, yeah, this demand, unfortunately, cannot be met just through the domestic production alone, especially because, you know, Indonesia has its own limitation in agricultural productivity. And so it opens the door for strategic partnerships with the United States and Australia, which is the major food exporters. And the US, especially, it already supplies 90% of soybean to Indonesia, in Indonesia. And we know that Australia is Indonesia's beef and dairy suppliers. So the Indonesian government keen to use to boost the exports for these products to support not only the free meal program, but especially to the US, is also to boost the US export to address the tariff issue. So recently, a delegation of government officials and Indonesia Chamber of Commerce, Kadin, came to the US to actually identify which agricultural products that they can actually source more from the US so that they can help boost the 16 billion trade deficit that they have. So they see that soybeans, wheat, and powdered milk will be the most likely agricultural items that they can buy from the US. It has looked at one point importing live cattle from the US. However, given that, it will take months to get, from the US to Indonesia. So if they try to transport live cattle, it probably end up as the dead cattle. So it's too challenging. So, but we see that Australia can actually fill this gap because it's neighbors. So agriculture is definitely one of the most important sector that it's a win-win for all the three countries. And beyond food supplies, we see that the government is also really focused on improving its food security. So it's also we see this also creates significant opportunities for US and Australian agri-tech firms to offer innovative solutions in farming, logistic, and supply chain management. We talk about agri-tech, fertilizer, GMO is one of the key things that the government is now looking at. And so, Australia and Indonesia should introduce more of these technologies to Indonesia. The second sector that I think would be another win-win for the three countries will be the higher education. So Indonesia recognizes the urgent need to invest in its human capital. So in the recent 2024 World Competitiveness Ranking by the IMD, International Institute for Management Development, Indonesia ranked 43rd out of 67 economies. So it lagged behind its Asian peers, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia. And so the government has seen this as one of the biggest issues when they try to lure foreign investment coming to Indonesia. They have to compete with Vietnam and Malaysia because again, it needs to address the skilling issues. So the government has made major investment through LPDP scholarship. They created budget for a significant budget for education as well, primary education. But it still need to be more focused on the upskilling. And if we talk about the upskilling, the LPDP scholarship previously focused on sending talented Indonesians abroad, like the US and Australia. Recently, there has been a shift toward prioritizing in-country scholarship. I think the idea is that they don't need to send as much stipend so that they can increase the volume instead of the quality. They increase the volume or the quantity of the amount of students. And so we see that this will open the new opportunity for US and Australian institutions, not just in attracting outbound students, but also in bringing these education institutions directly to Indonesia. So we know that Georgetown University, Monash University have already established campuses in the country. And we think that other global education providers could follow suit, especially at a time when, fewer Chinese students are coming into the US or Australia under the current geopolitical situation. So again, a win-win situation. The third one that could be a really good cooperation is in the healthcare sector. So in line with the president's job creation agenda, Prabowo again believing in his father's manifest that to be a strong nation, to be employable, people have to be both smart and healthy, and that's why he's been pushing all this social assistance program. So we know for healthcare, he recently launched a program to provide annual health checkups to 60 million Indonesians, starting with low-income populations, aiming to eventually cover all 280 million citizens. The current minister has been transforming the healthcare industry. The Minister of Health has been transforming the entire healthcare industry. He's focusing on upgrading the country's healthcare infrastructure, including adding 10,000 primary healthcare centers, 3,000 hospitals across 500 districts. And he has been calling out for significant investments in medical equipment, health technologies, and training. The minister came to DC a lot, speaking to the World Bank, getting more. They just got a $400 billion loan from the bank to basically supplies these healthcare infrastructure and medical equipment. So we see, again, this is where the US and Australia can play a vital role by supplying cutting-edge medical devices, hospital system, and insurance models, as well as clinical expertise. And for the latter, the clinical expertise, Indonesia has opened up its healthcare industry by allowing foreign doctors to practice in the country. So there's a lot of opportunity in here. And given that Gatra and Anne-Marie has talked about, national security, probably just adding a little bit on defense side, I think this is also something that creates a good opportunity, collaboration opportunity for the three countries. If we talk about defense, we know that Prabowo, he come from the defense background. If we talk about DOGE, government efficiency, Prabowo also just conducted government efficiency, noted only the defense ministry that doesn't get a significant budget cut. So he cares about defense. One of the things, as Anne-Marie has put it, the government has said that they're probably going to buy some arms to address the trade imbalances. So this is something that obviously will be a good opportunity. I talked to the delegation coming to DC a couple of weeks ago to negotiate. They are looking to buy some arms or other defense equipment from the US. They're just looking something that is right for their needs. But even so, it doesn't leave the Australia to take part as well in this collaboration. So I will stop there and looking forward for the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you discussing the relationship between Indonesia, Australia, and the United States when it comes to Indonesia's critical markets. So thank you all for talking and discussing your expertise here. And we have heard from our three panelists across the board, from foreign policy initiatives, bilateral relationships, and areas for cooperation. But as always, there is more to be said. So I do have a few questions for our panelists, starting with Gatra. So Prime Minister Albanese is visiting Prabowo later this evening, making Indonesia the Prime Minister's first international visit since being reelected. I wanted to know what we can expect to develop from this meeting.
Thanks, Pat. So I think for the most part, the meeting will be largely symbolic. We do know that I think issues like food, energy resilience, trade, and just broader international security issues will be subjects in discussion between Prabowo and Albanese. I'm not entirely certain that there will be any serious practical or tangible outcome that comes out of it. Probably a few agreements that have been probably a few things that have been lined up in the past or are ongoing. The purpose of the visit largely, I think, is to several things. Firstly, it's always been a tradition for Australian prime ministers to go to Jakarta as a first state visit. In a way, it's meant to signal this idea that regional partnerships matter just as much, if not matter just as much as Australia's relationship with great powers. And you might I'm not sure if viewers would recall, but Prabowo's call with Albanese congratulating him, which was I think which was published online, had Albanese say to Prabowo, Mr. President, can you do me a favor? I'd like to visit Jakarta for my first day visit, not Washington, not Beijing. So again, that's meant to signal, again, regional partnerships matter. And the Albanese government has been investing a lot, I think, in relationship with Southeast Asia. There's the Southeast Asia economic strategy that came up. It has really bolstered its partnerships with Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. So there's that. Also, I think Albanese has been, he missed proposed inauguration. In the past, Australian prime ministers again go to the inauguration of the Indonesian president. At the time, there was a royal visit by King Charles, so he opted for that over Jakarta. So this is really to make up for that. So overall, I think again the meeting will be more symbolic than have serious tangible outcomes.
Thank you, Gatra. So next for Anne-Marie. You discussed several different factions and approaches in foreign policy under the President Trump 2.0 administration. But what stuck out to me was you discussed in the Indo-Pacific sort of a strongman approach versus a restrained approach and its effect on Indonesia. So let's say if the US has a strongman approach and it pressures the PRC, well, this could also put pressure on Indonesia in trying to force them to pick a side. On the other hand, if the US is more restrained and frees up some space for Indonesia to have more wiggle room in its foreign policy, it also leaves some space for the PRC and any aggressive actions potentially in the South China Sea and the North Natuna Sea. So I'm just wondering from your perspective, if you see that what the right balance is between restraint and a strongman approach that can promote collaboration between the United States and Indonesia?
I mean, it's really going to be a reaction to what happens with the US and China, right? The US has not played much of a role at all in the North Natuna Sea, the way it has obviously with its ally, the Philippines, or even giving staunch support to Vietnam. There is a difference in how both countries perceive that, right? I mean, my Indonesian friends, and you folks can correct me if I'm wrong, Indonesia's position is that this is an issue over resources, right? It's not an issue over territory, and therefore it's not zero sum, and it can be resolved through some type of deals. The US does not see it that. It sees it as black and white, UNCLOS or not. And so there is a disconnect between how the US and Indonesia view that. And, it's really hard to see the US stepping into Natuna unless it was asked, and it's very difficult to envision circumstances under which that would occur, right? Even the Philippines has been very careful. Vietnam has been very careful. So I'm not sure we will see something unless there is some major escalation in the broader region over Taiwan or something else.
Certainly. The national security strategy has yet to release, and there's still certain time to see how these sort of relations will develop, especially in the South China Sea, but it's certainly something to take a look at. So for Ms. Sitepu, I have a question on the critical Indonesian markets. So Indonesia over the past 10 years has seen tremendous growth in GDP, and then more than other ASEAN nations, besides possibly the Philippines. But from my knowledge, there are still areas that Indonesia wants to enter in or develop, specifically the digital economy, entering US supply chains. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more on how Indonesia can work with the United States and Australia to strengthen something like digital economy, or to what degree the Indonesia and US supply chains can increase and how it can become more integrated.
Sure. So if we talk about the digital economy, so I think first, again, we have to take a step back. We have to look at the infrastructure first, right? So in terms of infrastructure, Indonesia is still heavily relied on the Chinese, digital infrastructure. And so this creates an opportunity for the West, like the Western technologies from the either from Australia or the US to provide alternative for this Chinese digital infrastructure. I know the US has been trying to, implement the subsea cables across Asia Pacific. This is something that the Indonesia government needs to be convinced of, how important it is. I mean, I know some ministries are open to that, but given that Indonesia has a very complex bureaucracy, it delays the decision-making process. And so again, like this is an opportunity for the US to step in to improve the security of digital infrastructure. That's from the infrastructure side. And then the second one, we can take a look at the skilling side. So Indonesia has the biggest mobile penetration in Southeast Asia, and more than 50% of all the payments done are digitally. And so there's a lot of opportunity on this. However, it still ranks very low in the digital competitiveness and also future readiness when it compares to, again, Asian peers, Southeast Asian peers. And so there needs to be a lot of upskilling, skilling, for the Indonesians to use these digital setups to improve their economy. And that's that's the one thing that again the US and Australia can take part on, like how to improve this digital competitiveness. I think one of the issues is also about, if we're talking about investment in Indonesia, a lot of companies are concerned about the data protection issues. And so until like the government can actually, address this, probably there will be some delay until, companies will want to invest in this sector. And we talk about like supply chain. I think the biggest ambition from Indonesia is actually getting into the critical mineral, right? And how to leverage its critical mineral supply. So either getting into the EV supply chain or getting into the semiconductor supply chain through its critical mineral. It's something that the Indonesian government has been very ambitious to do. We know that the government has been trying to get the Indonesian government has been trying to get the CMA critical mineral agreement with the US, and it's also one of the things that they actually do put on their tariff negotiations. They're willing to supply critical mineral to the US for the US to advance its semiconductor industry onshore. So, however, until the Indonesian can make sure that we can have a cleaner supply, then again, that's one of the homeworks that the Indonesian government has to address before they can get into the supply chain, because otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to get foreign investment into these sectors.
Certainly, it's certainly a difficult feat. However, it's something that is a priority, and I really appreciate you speaking on this. And to zoom out a bit and discuss something of bilateral and minilateral relations between Australia, the United States, and Indonesia, I do have a question just for the panel. So whoever wants to speak first, feel free. So we see minilaterals between the US and other nations in the region, including the Philippines and Japan, AUKUS, and the Quad. Some of these include not just US allies, but also partners like India. So from your perspective, what is the likelihood for a strategic minilateral relationship between the US, Australia, and Indonesia? And what are the benefits or downsides of such a partnership?
I'm happy to kick off. So I think broadly, Indonesia is not necessarily allergic to minilaterals. It is part of a few minilaterals. It's part of the Sulu Sea patrols with the Philippines and Malaysia, the Malacca Strait patrols with Malaysia and Singapore, and there's this emerging minilateral we're talking about that's still quite diplomatic at this stage that involves Australia, India, and Indonesia. What I think one thing that a lot of these minilaterals have in common is that they're focused on a particular security issue, right? The Sulu Sea patrols is all about securing the Sulu Sea. Malacca Strait patrol is all about securing the Malacca Strait. They're fairly threat agnostic. If sure, transnational crime, people smugglers, maybe what else? Just criminal organizations, terrorist groups, but it's not focused on any particular nation state. Yeah, and that's I think the problem. If you have a U.S. Australia Indonesia trilateral, it really does depend on what the purpose of the trilateral is. If the purpose is about securing the seas from pirates, then I think it's feasible. I think Indonesia might be okay with it. I think if it's about cooperation on resourcing or resources in the Indian Ocean, maybe it's possible as well. But if it's about, for example, securing the Natuna Sea against possible Chinese incursions, that's probably going to be very unlikely, because Indonesia is very concerned about minilaterals that are focused firstly on countering China or any other country for that matter. Because again, going back to sort of one of the key elements of Indonesian foreign policy, which is it wants to be as friends with as many countries as possible to accrue foreign capital. But outside of that, again, I mean, I think that's been one of the key criticisms against Quad and AUKUS, right? Does it really have that effect of deterrence? So I'm not sure Indonesia would be willing to cooperate with Australia and the US if the purpose was on China. But if it's on other non-traditional security issues, it's definitely possible.
Thank you, Gatra.
Can I jump in?
Certainly.
I see that as being fairly unlikely, in part because the U.S. has a tendency to want to lead everything, right, that it joins. And I see Gatra laughing there. And it's difficult to see an issue on which the three countries would find sufficient common interest to do that. Gatra mentioned some non-traditional security issues. I don't see any major issue that would warrant, a minilateral being created unless there was some really, counterterrorism, something or other going on there that was not directed against a state. And I just want to make a comment, and it's not exactly on this issue of minilateral, but it's an issue that I think helps explain why the US knows how to cooperate so easily with Australia and not with Indonesia. If you look at US ties with major non-aligned countries, the US does not manage them well. And this is not just Indonesia, it's South Africa, it's Brazil, India, until India began to really view China as a threat and then joined the Quad and other mechanisms. The US has a tendency to view countries in terms of allies or adversaries, right? And so Australia is a true blue ally. The US has a playbook for that. The DPK is a true blue adversary. The US knows how to do that. Countries like Indonesia, the US has always had a difficult time trying to forge sufficient commonalities, even when there are good, solid interests. And that's why I don't see the minilateral, but it's also just a background condition to the broader US-Indonesia relationship.
Thank you, Anne-Marie.
And it goes along with, sorry, I didn't mean to go, but Gatra's comment about Indonesia's staunch nationalism and commitment to anti-colonialism, the US and the Indonesian positions often butt heads on those differences.
Certainly. Mehu, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm looking from the commercial side of things. Yeah, so if you look at IPAF recently, where obviously it's already gone to the void. I think like Indonesia has been always very pragmatic in this kind of like cooperation. So there's if by pragmatic is that they always see that what is the what is the benefit of getting into a cooperation, especially from the economic side of things. And so that's why they were keen on joining IPAF, keen on joining like all economic or trading blocks. And so again, like I totally agree with Marianne that this is very unlikely, especially under the current U.S. government. And so if there is a push towards making a common economic cooperation out of like the three countries, then there's a possibility, but I don't see that happening under the current government, the U.S. government.
Thank you. So what I'm getting from all three panelists is that this sort of trilateral or minilateral is very unlikely to occur, at least in name, because it's hard to cooperate all on one issue and then put it out publicly. However, Indonesia is very important to Australia, Australia important to the United States, all around here. So there still is area for cooperation, although it may not be in the form of a minilateral that you see in something like AUKUS or the Quad. But to kind of expand on a point that Anne-Marie discussed in her presentation, there is a lot of this talk about choosing sides. There's discussions about non-aligned movements, and Indonesia is a founder of the non-aligned movement. So when it comes to this discussion of great power competition between the US and the PRC, there is an assumption that non-aligned nations, such as ASEAN nations, have to choose sides. Do you think this is a correct assumption? And if not, what are the costs associated with trying to force a nation like Indonesia to pick a side? Yes, Emery?
I think it's a really false assumption. I would recommend everybody read Thomas Park's fantastic new book, Southeast Asia's Multipolar Future. I think that all Southeast Asian countries have been hedging. They don't want to be pressured to join either the US or the Chinese side. They want to maintain their strategic autonomy. They want to maximize both their security and economic benefits from engaging with a multiplicity of countries, not just the US and China, but Australia, Japan, South Korea, etc. And as a result of the hedging and diversification strategies of the Southeast Asian states, right, which illustrates small state agency in contrast to this top-down notion of bipolar great power competition, which says, small states do what they must, or great powers do what they must, and small states suffer what they must. You really see in Southeast Asia a growing multipolar world, I would argue, and that this binary strategy is wrong. And I actually think it's bad policy for the US, because when we look at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies annual, State of Southeast Asia survey, what do we see? We see that the majority of Southeast Asians want to choose China, not the US. So why the heck are we pressuring them? I mean, it's utterly counter to US interests, in my humble opinion.
If I can add, I mean, I completely agree with what Anne-Marie has said. I think Indonesia, like most of Southeast Asia, have just continued to hedge for the simple reason that, again, you want to, get as much economic and diplomatic gain as possible, like from not just the U.S. and China, but also from Japan, from India, from Australia, and there are a lot of powers that these countries try to engage with, and it is specific to Indonesia. It is a fact that I think whenever something comes up with China, you make some kind of effort to also engage the Americans or the Europeans or the Japanese. This goes for both security as well as defense. Part of the reason why I think you see Indonesia deepening its security ties with China and Russia, for example, is because we've been quite dependent on the West now. Let's balance it out with China and Russia. So there's this logic that you don't want to be too dependent on one country or the other. Of course, on dependence, I mean it's an interesting topic, right? Because you might ask for more support from, say, the Europeans or the Americans, but you might not necessarily get it, or vice versa. You might ask for more support from the Chinese or the Russians, but you might not get it. I think where there might be an issue about where Indonesia needs to choose is when I think there is that pressure, external pressure, that for you to continue to engage with us on a specific subject, you must reduce dependence on another country. And then when I say this, I'm primarily thinking of the tech competition space. Indonesia is, I think, when it comes to ICT, especially, quite dependent on Chinese tech. And this has an effect of locking in Indonesia to certain vendors, especially when it comes to Huawei, for example. This has its own problems for Indonesia when it comes to, say, when it wants to choose alternative vendors. So this is a form of locking in, of a form of forcing Indonesia. Well, it's one way in which Indonesia ends up losing that autonomy to make a choice, right? At the same time, dependence on Chinese tech, if that becomes a problem with the US under Trump administration or something else, then that also restricts Indonesia's choices. So for the most part, again, I think countries just want to be able to do business and get away with whatever.
Yeah, I just want to add some anecdotes to actually emphasize what Gatra and Anne-Marie has said. So when we met with the Indonesian delegation to DC a couple of weeks ago to negotiate on tariff, they actually said, there are red lines. We're gonna we're gonna buy more stuff from the US. We're gonna do the regulation or whatever it is related to the non-tariff barriers that the US has demanded, but we do have red lines. And when we talk about that red lines, it's actually they can't force us to stop dealing with China. So again, I don't think this is something that, even the Indonesian government has made it very clear in their tariff negotiations. So I don't think the USG will push further.
Certainly. And foreign policy in Southeast Asia has shown to be quite a delicate and complex issue, especially when it comes to these non-aligned states. So it is difficult for the United States to, let's say, enter a strong bilateral or minilateral agreement and to kind of push forward and get some of these countries to pressure a country like the PRC. You do see it with an ally like the Philippines, but even there it is quite difficult. But while we have this focus on Indonesian foreign policy, I do have one more question for the panel. So in Prabowo's manifesto before becoming elected, he did have a lot of emphasis about making Indonesia a great country on the world stage. And of course, he does have background as a defense minister and has emphasis there as well. However, from what each panelist has discussed tonight, there are some pressing domestic issues in Indonesia. So I do wonder, as Prabowo tries to enter the world stage with recently joining BRICS, attempting to expand in other areas as well, how much do the domestic issues hinder Indonesia's ability to focus outward? And can the US or Australia put themselves in a position to assist Indonesia over the next few years? It is a difficult one.
Can I maybe just make one or two comments about this?
Certainly.
I mean, you're right. Prabowo had that in his manifesto, and he's been the active foreign policy president, right? Very different from Jokowi. He showed up at everything. Jokowi never attended the UN here in his 10 years, right? But I don't think that Prabowo has a strategic objective, right? I mean, what exactly is he seeking to accomplish? So Jokowi didn't join the BRICS because he didn't see the economic benefit, but Prabowo says that the BRICS is going to bring, economic benefits to Indonesia. That's kind of unclear, He goes to Beijing, then to the US, then he's off to Russia. And obviously, as Mehu and Gatra said, that's part of like hedging, right? Signaling that you're not going to get too close to everybody. But, what is the key deliverable? How does all of that promote Indonesian interests? And I haven't quite seen a good definition of that, which gets to this question of, is this just kind of, symbolic? We're a great power, we're the, fourth largest country in the world, largest Muslim majority, et cetera, pay attention to us? Or is it really tied to interests? And that to me is still a question mark. Because it hasn't really evidenced itself. And can I just well, forget it. You guys go.
Yes, Patrick, can I add one question, I guess, to that for the panel?
Please.
I appreciate those comments, and I wonder the same thing and don't know, but I'm asking you if that is a failure of leadership in Indonesia, that you just haven't had a president or a political entrepreneur with the skills to be able to recognize what those interests are, to recognize that the people are in a particular place, and then to push that forward, or if the internal divisions inside Indonesia are so vast or so great that there isn't a common, or it's not a single Indonesian interest to promote, and that it's that division or fracturing of interests which keeps us in flux.
So I can sort of add. I mean, I think just listening Greg and what Maria said, and also what you mentioned, Pat. Sort of like a defining feature of Indonesian foreign policy since independence is this idea that a country of Indonesia's size should be very proactive, right, in the international system. And I think the main problem had always been we don't have the domestic capacity to sort of support, or material capacity to support our ambitions. Now, in the past, there was a global maritime fulcrum. This was a vision that President Jokowi had. Well, I mean, it's complicated because it was designed by his team, but then Jokowi himself, being a person who was uninterested in foreign policy, more interested in the economic dimensions actually of the global maritime fulcrum, meant that the vision never really came through. But the basic idea was to transform Indonesia into a proper maritime power that had the naval capabilities to secure shores, was able to also become more proactive in maritime diplomacy. I mean, Indonesia at one point really did try to reinvigorate the Indian Ocean Rim Association, IORA. I mean, that completely fell through. I mean, there's just been no further follow-up. Indonesia did push through the ASEAN Indo-Pacific strategy. It's now just a constant statement that people repeat over and over again without any serious interest in sort of getting any tangible outcomes out of it. Prabowo, as Maria said, really he has not really presented an alternative vision to Indonesian foreign policy. I mean, even in discussions in Indonesia, his speeches and so on, he just talks about Indonesia being a great power, a negara besar, or a big power, a nation that has to be respected. But he hasn't really explained how he seeks to achieve that. My sense is that, for example, joining BRICS is part of his way of trying to find leverage. And for a period of Indonesian foreign diplomatic history that I think a lot of nationalists look back to is the early 60s. when President Sukarno was able to do a bit of a dance and manipulate the Soviets and the Americans into getting West Papua, right? Because at the time, it was only 1961, up until the 60s, West Papua was still under Dutch control. And then he was able to convince the Americans to pressure the Dutch to give West Papua to Indonesia. So that's a time period that I think that has seen this super romanticized in Indonesia. It's not that there isn't anyone in the Indonesian system that has tried to think through of what Indonesia's place should be in a world of deepening strategic competition between the US and China. It's just that, going back to something I mentioned in my remarks earlier, Prabowo is his own foreign policy advisor. So it's not like it's not like the foreign minister can deliver a blueprint. It's not like CSIS, one of the key think tanks in the country, can deliver a blueprint. It's not like there's an advisor akin to, say, the status of Rizal Sukma or even Andi Wijoyanto who can sort of guide foreign policy formulation. Prabowo just does his own thing. I mean, the story about, I don't know if you recall a couple of years back when he came up with a peace plan for Russia and Ukraine at the Shangri-La dialogue, that was all him. That was not, no one actually advised him on that. So he comes up with these ideas and he just pushes through. And again, this is the problem about having, depending on an informal network of loyalists, right? No one's there to contest you. No one's there to say, this is the wrong move. This is going to be a problem for our national interest. So at the moment, with the current foreign policy structure, yes, the president has always been at the top. But what differs between Prabowo and Jokowi is that at the very least, Jokowi had advisors who he listened to. The advisors might not necessarily be able to get things through. I mean, again, like the Global Maritime Fulcrum fell through. But at the very least, they listened to some advisors. With Prabowo, it's all about his vision, whatever that is.
Fantastic. Thank you. I would like to conclude with a few words and really thank our panelists for an encapsulating discussion on Indonesian-US-Australian relations. I'd also like to thank our audience for joining in from across the Indo-Pacific region. So going forward, we urge you to keep an eye on the interplay between security and trade in these nations. And let's see how leadership in and beyond the headlines can propel us to a freer and more prosperous Indo-Pacific region. We'll see you next time.
Thank you much, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.